The Sony PlayStation launched in Japan on December 3rd, 1994, 1 week after the Sega Saturn. While it was initially hard to tell which of the two would come out on top, it was with the PS1's North American launch on September 9th, 1995 that the system truly took off and was solidified as the first 3D game console to have widespread success. Now, there are certainly a number of factors that led to this success, and one is a strong lineup of games. Crossing various genres, the launch lineup included a little of something for everybody, and while they aren't all classics, some of them actually are and are still very well regarded to this day. So, let's take a look at all 12 of the games that greeted the English-speaking world on the legendary system's release. To make things easy, let's go in alphabetical order. First up is Namco's Air Combat, a game that was later completely ripped off by another Namco series, Ace Combat. Kidding. But yeah, for some reason they thought Air Combat was a better title for English-speaking regions until Ace Combat 2 came out. Kinda strange, but better sooner than later, I suppose. Anyway, let's take a look at the game. If you couldn't guess by the name, it's an aerial combat simulator where you take on various missions, such as defeating a group of enemies or taking out specific structures. After each mission, you are rewarded with currency you can spend on newer planes or use to pay for backup in some of the harder stages. As far as early 3D games go, this game holds up very well. Nothing about its controls feel awkward, and taking out enemy planes is as satisfying now as ever. I really like the missions where you need to destroy designated targets. There's a whole strategy to it, and it's just so fun blowing that stuff up. One little oddity, this game uses the Japanese standard of using the circle button to confirm and X to cancel. In fact, a good chunk of the launch games use this layout. I personally prefer using the circle button to confirm, so I kind of wish it was what won out in Western territories, but sadly, X was what did it. Air Combat was an impressive showcase of what a 32-bit system could do, and one of several PlayStation launch games that launched a series that still continues to this day. Battle Arena Toshinden was the PlayStation's first 3D fighter. It feels somewhat reminiscent of Soul Blade and Soul Calibur due to the fact that you fight using weapons rather than going the more traditional route of hand-to-hand combat. It features a cast of anime tropes, from the sexy whip lady to the generic headband-wearing main character guy, all with their own hilariously 90s English dubs. These can range from annoying to just plain bad. I had this game as a kid and played it quite a bit, but even at a young age, I knew it had issues. The gameplay is far from perfect. When not running, you move insanely slow. Also, the jumping is very floaty. And the reach of the weapons seems just a tad too short. It's kind of an awkward feeling game overall. I do like how pressing the shoulder buttons makes you dodge left or right. It adds to the strategy and is actually kind of fun pulling off. It's also pretty fun winning by ring out, even if it is kind of cheap sometimes. It's even better when both characters do it and it ends in a tie. Oh, and I should probably mention that the game has a great soundtrack. It may be lacking in a lot of areas, but the music is definitely not one of them. When this came out, it was touted as one of the PlayStation's biggest exclusives, and Sophia, the whip lady, was heavily used in advertisements. But boy, after playing it, the Saturn must have looked a lot better to fighting game fans. They did have Virtua Fighter after all. Still, PlayStation more than made up for this with its exclusive release of Tekken only 2 months later.
Sweet dreams! Game over!
ESPN Extreme Games is a somewhat strange take on the extreme sports genre. The game features single-lap races between different extreme sports vehicles. These include skateboards, mountain bikes, street luges, and roller skates. Does such a race even exist? Anyway, as you race, mostly downhill, you have to avoid obstacles such as trains, falling boulders, and closing doors inside an ancient ruin. Yeah, it gets pretty crazy. You also have to battle your fellow racers by punching or kicking them, a bit like Road Rash. It's kinda hilarious when it happens to the street luge. Actually, what's even more hilarious is that ESPN were completely cool with this. I like how when you change the game's volume, it's like there's a dude there testing a mic.
Test.
Actually, scratch that. It's super annoying after like 3 seconds. So how does it play? Well, to put it simply, you probably aren't going to be winning on your first time playing. It's really unforgiving. Every time I started getting ahead, I'd end up crashing either because of an opponent or an obstacle and end up losing all my progress. I don't think I ever placed higher than 10th out of 16, and this was on the easiest difficulty. Okay, I did manage to get 9th once, but that's still not great. This game was later followed up by a sequel, 2 Extreme, after which subsequent versions of this game were renamed 1 Extreme. Apparently, this was due to Sony losing the ESPN license. In a time before Tony Hawk, I suppose this would have been an okay game to play if you wanted something extreme sports related. But we live in a post-Tony Hawk world, so unless you really dig the gameplay, you're better off avoiding this one.
What do you mean? This one didn't even finish the race? What a loser. I don't have time for this.
And now onto Kileak, the DNA Imperative. This is one of the more poorly reviewed games of the PS1's launch. And it's also one of the more cinematic. It involves infiltrating a South Pole research facility in a mech suit while fighting off countless robots that try to stop you. It's a good example of Sony's original design philosophy for the PlayStation's buttons. Square is menu, circle is confirm or shoot, and X is cancel. Select is to select your weapons, and start seemingly does nothing. It certainly doesn't pause the game. Anyway, on to the gameplay. Killing enemies is actually fairly satisfying. But it also takes forever to do. Since there's no auto fire, at least in the 2 weapons I came across, you have to constantly tap on the fire button, and most enemies take a lot of hits. Still, the combat can be fairly intense, I'll give it that. One thing that's really not great, 90% of the time you're in very narrow hallways, so taking on enemies involves continually strafing left and right in the limited space you have and hoping you get their firing pattern down in order to dodge everything. It reminds me a bit of one of the Japanese PS1 launch games, Crime Crackers. I would actually compare Kileak's gameplay favorably since in Crime Crackers you couldn't move forward and shoot at the same time. So, it controls fine, it's just the overall level design that could have used some work. Oh, and you have this battery level you need to keep track of. It drains slow enough that you usually don't need to worry about it, but if it does get around the 25% level, you hear this.
Battery low. Battery low.
And it never stops, at least until you get your battery back to an acceptable level. It's super annoying, and comical. You forget that's a thing that games really used to do. So, what's good about the game? Well, it does have some pretty good techno music in a lot of the stages. I didn't hate my time with the game, but I don't need to go back to it. If you're curious about an early Japanese take on the FPS genre, you may want to check this out. For everyone else though, I'd say this one is safe to skip.
Welcome to NBA Jam!
NBA Jam Tournament Edition is an updated version of the extremely popular arcade game. For those who don't know the series, it's a 2-on-2 basketball game. Thanks to its arcade roots, it's much more approachable than most sports games. The 2-on-2 aspect makes the game very fast-paced and fun. And even if you know nothing about basketball, it's simple enough that even newcomers can get the hang of it fairly quickly. So, what's new in this version? Well, apparently they added a few new modes as well as an extra player to each team. Although it's still limited to 2 versus 2, you could choose from 3 selectable players to make up your team. This game is definitely one of the less graphically impressive ones we'll be looking at, though it is still a bit better looking than previous gen versions of the same game. Here is the Sega CD version for context. One notable thing about this game is its secret characters. If you enter in the right information at the records screen, you can unlock players such as Bill or Hillary Clinton. Here I am in a team up with Dennis Rodman and Bill Clinton, the ultimate team. This strangely makes it one of 2 Sony System launch games to feature the Clintons as secret characters, the other being Ready to Rumble Boxing Round 2 for the PS2. I also better mention the Fresh Prince himself, Will Smith, is another secret character. These unlockables might be my favorite thing about the game. While not as impressive as some of the other launch games, this is still a very solid and recommendable version of an all-time classic. Power Serve 3D Tennis. This game is bad. While a lot of the PS1's launch games have at least some sort of redeeming quality, like an awesome soundtrack, this game has nothing. I mean, listen to this. Who thought that was good? Or tennis-y. It's a tennis game, by the way. Let's switch to one of the less grating songs. Okay, that's a little better. Anyway, look at this. God, if you wanted to impress people with the PS1's 3D graphics, this would not be the game to show them. I mean, look at the crowd, they're not even that far away and they look like a quilt blanket. The character animations aren't bad, I guess. They're not great either. The character names in this game are interesting. There's Andy Legacy, Mark Sunrise, and Julia Cappuccino, to name a few. So, for some reason, this is the default camera angle when playing. This weird semi-first person view that switches to third person when you hit the ball. You can switch to a much more natural angle though, but this angle is even harder to hit the ball because you can no longer see its shadow. If you wanted to, you could set the computer to play itself. I guess that's good if you wanted some kind of background distraction. Just turn off that terrible music and let it go. So that is one thing it has going for it, I guess. And one more thing, better mention that, again, this is a game that uses Circle to confirm. You would have really been scraping the bottom of the barrel to have gotten this at the PS1's launch. You want a fun 3D tennis game from the days of yore? Play Virtua Tennis. Next up is the Raiden Project, a port of two arcade games, Raiden 1 and 2. When you start up the game, you are greeted with an incredibly cool demo featuring a 3D rendition of the two games' combat. Seriously, look at this! It would have been a really cool thing to see upon booting up your brand new 3D capable system. It's a shame though, it's not how the gameplay actually looks. But that's not to say the gameplay is bad, in fact, it's very fun. There are plenty of satisfying to use weapons along with some awesome sprite work. When enemies are defeated, they'll explode and leave craters, sometimes destroying part or all of the buildings they land on. Bosses and various stronger enemies will show signs of damage. It's some pretty impressive detail. My only gripe with the gameplay is that you move much slower than most enemies and projectiles, making avoiding hits more difficult than it should be. I suck at these kind of games though, so maybe my complaint isn't valid. Besides the intro, the game had some other nice extras. You could choose the original music or remixed versions. You might as well go with the remixed since it took advantage of the PlayStation's improved sound, though it's ultimately up to personal taste. And this game is another example of an early PlayStation game that used the circle button to confirm. It really was the Wild West in terms of which button confirmed for the system's first few years. It would have been amazing if the game actually looked how it appeared in its opening demo, but the game you're left with is still fairly worthwhile. Funny enough, it took the series another 10 years to finally get its 3D follow-up. This would have been a good pickup for anyone who wasn't concerned about graphics. While a majority of the American PlayStation launch games were all about showing off the system's 3D capabilities, Rayman was there to show just how good a 2D game could look with the power of 32 bits. In terms of graphics, this game for sure holds up better than anything else we'll be looking at. I mean, look at it, it's beautiful. The backgrounds and smooth character animations make it feel like you're playing a very European cartoon. And it sounds great too, with an equally enchanting soundtrack, as well as some excellent sound design. I mean, this has to be one of the most satisfying sounds on the PS1. The game has a cool sense of progress, where as you get further, you unlock new abilities, such as gliding or being able to swing from certain obstacles. It gives you a reason to go back to previous levels to get to areas you couldn't reach before. Now, with all that said, there's one big thing that doesn't hold up well at all, and that's the difficulty. God, this game is so hard. After the first few areas, this game just becomes ruthless. While I did compliment the sound design, this is one sound you definitely will get sick of hearing. Luckily, if like me as a kid you had access to Tips and Tricks or any other magazine that had the 100% completion password, you could see everything without doing all the work. And that made the game fun despite its over-the-top difficulty. And now, we get to what is widely considered to be the best PS1 launch game, Ridge Racer. And, you know what, I completely agree, this game is great. It's an extremely fast and addictive arcade racer taking place on a single track that has slight variations on higher difficulties. Now, I know what you're thinking, one track is not enough. And yeah, by today's standards, it's not much. But the game is all about mastering that track. And believe me, mastering it is no simple task. It took me about an hour to finally place first on the easiest difficulty. But man, it is such a feeling of accomplishment when you do it. And once you beat the track on one difficulty, you will instantly want to move on to the next. Thus, the whole process starts again. And the harder it gets, the higher your max speed. Things can get pretty intense. And while it is just one track, they sure packed as much detail into it as they could. From the airplane and helicopters flying by, to the setting sun, to the lights on this building making Pac-Man's face. Namco made something that was truly amazing to look at. I should also mention the game's awesome loading screen, which is a stage from one of Namco's older games, Galaxian. That itself is cool, but if you manage to beat all 14 on-screen enemies, you unlock a whopping 8 extra cars, bringing the total from a measly 4 up to an impressive 12. And speaking of things that are awesome, once the game is loaded, you could swap out the disc with any music CD and listen to it while racing. That is just plain cool. Though, the game's own soundtrack is so good, you might just want to stick with that. And you could even listen to those tracks in the game's music player if you wanted. Seriously, for such a small game, Ridge Racer is quite impressive. Even playing it now, it's evident why this was the must-play game from the PlayStation's launch. Street Fighter the movie is the second of 3 fighting games we'll be looking at, and this one is not in 3D. Though, that's not the most notable thing about it. What does make it notable is just how bizarre of a license this is. It's a game based on a movie that's based on a game. And it's not just that, there's the fact that it is so similar visually to Street Fighter's biggest rival, Mortal Kombat. In fact, it was put out in the US by the same publishers as Mortal Kombat, Acclaim. Though it was still developed by Capcom. It might just be the closest thing we'll ever get to a Mortal Kombat Street Fighter crossover. A very strange case indeed. Anyway, if you know how to play Street Fighter, you'll have no problem getting into this one. All of the traditional moves are here, from Hadokens to spinning bird kicks to that electric shock thing Blanca does. It's just presented in a much different graphical style than usual. This game also has a story mode, which follows the plot of the movie portrayed with still images and text. They used real footage from the movie for the game's intro, but couldn't anywhere else? Maybe it was a storage issue. One thing I found to be absolutely annoying, unlike most fighters, even from this era, there's no way to quit to the main menu or restart a match by pausing, or at least I couldn't find a way to do it. You either have to lose or reset the system, and in the story mode, losing just makes the battle restart, so in that case, you have to reset. While the gameplay isn't particularly flawed, it definitely wasn't the best example of what the series had to offer. And even for those who absolutely had to have a Street Fighter on the PlayStation, less than 6 months later, Street Fighter Alpha would be released, giving you not much of a reason to play it after that. Next, we come to Total Eclipse Turbo, a port of the 1994 3DO game Total Eclipse. No, not the 1989 PC game with the same name. It's exactly what you'd expect from an early 3D space shooter. You fly through various environments, shooting at everything that gets in your way. It feels kind of like another early PS1 game, Philosoma. But this game is much worse. Anyway, the graphics are just okay, though I do like the effect the water and lava has. Completely unrealistic, but fun to look at regardless. Gameplay-wise, it could have been a bit more refined. Movement is very sensitive, and it doesn't help that enemies have super small hitboxes. The game has an interesting health system where your armor slowly drains, but is replenished with each defeated enemy. The small hitboxes sure don't help this system, but at least enemies are easier to hit once you power up your weapon. And you can always use your super powerful all-encompassing pink laser of death if you're really in a pinch. I do like using that thing. This game has no memory card save system, but does include a password system, which was actually the case for quite a few early PS1 games. I wonder why the game's publisher, Crystal Dynamics, thought they needed to include their logo in the password screen. You also see it in the pause menu. They must have been really proud of this game. Should they be? Well, no. Like I said earlier, there were better space shooters released not long after. In fact, you could have gone with the Raiden project and had a much better time as well. This one is definitely a skip. Closing out with Z is another 3D fighter, Zero Divide. What's that, you say? Didn't I say Battle Arena Toshinden was the system's first 3D fighter? Well, while they do share a US release date, Toshinden's original Japanese release still predated this game by several months. Zero Divide is unique in that its lineup of fighters is made entirely of robots, some of which are humanoid and some of which are more unusual, such as a dragon or a scorpion. And these characters are very detailed, at least for a PS1 game, especially when viewed in the selection screen. I had fun just looking at them. The developers definitely put a lot of work into making sure this game looked good. And sounded good. The soundtrack is excellent as well. In terms of presentation, the only other fighter from the time I can think of comparing it to is Tobal No. 1, which is also very unique in its own way. The game only uses 3 main buttons, to punch, kick, and block, making it fairly simple. Still, it's fun. Landing attacks is surprisingly satisfying, especially when you turn on the game's option of destructible body parts. Seriously, how cool is that? Why it isn't on by default is beyond me. Another thing this game has over its contemporaries is how it handles ring outs. Unlike Toshinden, you can actually hang on the ledges and recover from some falls. And when you do get a ring out, you get these explosions. It's win-win. Kind of. One more neat setting is the option of saving replays of matches to watch later. That really seems forward-thinking and futuristic for a game released in 1995. Considering how forgotten this is compared to some of the other games we've looked at, this is somewhat of a hidden gem from this launch lineup, and the standout among its selection of fighters. This for sure would have been the one to get if you were a fighting game fan.
I can't believe you're giving up so soon! You're such a baby! Go home to your mama!
Well, there you go. PlayStation launch games from A to Z. If you enjoyed this and want to know how these games stack up against the rest of the PS1 games that came out in 1995, you may want to check out my video ranking the top 7 PlayStation games from that year. And if you're curious about other Sony system launch games, I also have a video chronicling the PS2's massive launch lineup. Well, that about wraps things up, so as always, thanks for watching The Legend of Games.